Hello and welcome to today's tutorial organised by the UK Plastics Research Collaborative. My name is Tiffany Marie Borg and I am the teaching lead for the UK PRC. Today I am going to be talking to you about how to perform a literature review. So what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to start by getting a better idea about what a literature review is. We'll go into a little bit of a discussion about why perform it in the first place. And then the most important thing, we're going to go into how to structure the literature review, how to do it, and I'll show you an example that I've done to just clarify things as well. So a literature review is defined as an overview of previously published works. Essentially, it's a summary of everything that's been published in the past. Now, it's not the same thing as a systematic review. So there's different levels of evidence, which we've covered in a separate tutorial. Now, a systematic review we'll talk about separately, but essentially it follows a reproducible method and there's much more strict rules about how it's performed. A literature review is simpler in that sense because it's not so strict. You're essentially just looking at the different publications so far, and then you discuss them to provide a brief overview about a particular topic or a new piece of research. Overall, it's quite a good option to perform a literature review if you're considering performing research on a topic and you're not sure about how much information there is to date that's been released into the world. So why do it? So we've already said it identifies existing information about your topic of interest. By doing that, it also identifies gaps in the knowledge. If the project that you have in mind has already been talked about in a million ways, it avoids you from going down that route. So it prevents you from going down, reinventing the same thing and churning out the same publications that already exist. It's also a nice way to identify others who are working in the field. So plastics is my specialty, but it's already quite a niche field and it's already a small working environment. As soon as you start to delve into subspecialties within plastic surgery, be it facial nerve palsy or whatever it is, you start to realize that the same names start to crop up, and you might then meet these people when you're in conferences. You might decide that you want to do fellowships or go and visit these hospitals based on the similar interests and research that you've come across. So how do we structure a literature review? Well, it's quite similar to most publications in terms of a simple format. So you start with your abstract, then you do a brief introduction, your main body, which is what the focus of today's talk will be, and of course your conclusion. So what's the point of your abstract? So the abstract is there to provide an overview. It's essentially the blurb of a book, but an overview for your summary, for your publication. What do you need to include? So it's not quite the same format as some other abstracts. The exact format should depend on the sort of publishing author group that you're going with. But generally speaking, you're going with 200 to 250 words. You start with a bit of a background about your topic, so any sort of knowledge gaps. Then you talk about the whole point, so the purpose of your review. And then, of course, any key findings and conclusions that you identify from the literature that you've included in your review. So this is an example abstract from one of my papers. So you start off with your introduction. So just a very, very brief overview of what existing information there is, or if there isn't any, and of course, the aim for your paper. Then you talk about how you've performed your study. So you talk about if you've done a literature search, how you did that, from when to when, why you included certain literature. And then, of course, what papers you've included is going in your results, and the findings from those papers also goes in the results with your conclusion at the end. So how are we going to structure the main body of this paper? Well, you want to organize the literature according to some themes. So, for example, for this paper topic that we're going to kind of follow for today, you've got key subject areas. So, for example, you've got cleft lip and palate surgery, but now we're going to specify it into something specific. So for the purpose of this study, we're going to look at cleft lip and palate surgery for low-income countries, or training for low-income countries. You're essentially going from a general focus point to a narrower focus point in your literature review. And then, of course, your conclusion is a summary of the important aspects of the different parts of your study. So let's talk about an example paper. So here's our example paper. So we've already gone into a little bit of detail about our abstract. The introduction is relatively simple. So just a brief overview of the background for cleft lip and palate. So for this sort of project, the reason it's important to go into detail about cleft lip and palate training for low-income countries is because there's a high prevalence of these cases in developing countries. And it's not an expensive procedure to perform. So actually by addressing the training and performing it safely, you could make a big difference. Once you've gone into your introduction, the methodology can follow a fairly standardized approach. So it doesn't matter what topic you're talking about. You start off by saying what your search strategy was. So what tools did you use to find your information? So most commonly people use PubMed or Medline and Embase. Then you need to talk about how you found your papers. So in this particular study, we talked about training, teaching, education, and cleft as our different mesh terms. We'll go into detail about how to perform a literature search after this tutorial. Then, of course, you move on to talk about your inclusion and exclusion of your criteria. So you need to have a relatively clear idea of what constitutes as a paper that is relevant for your study. You can go into more detail for that by adding supplementary files when you're structuring your manuscript. By doing that, it avoids loads of sort of jargon and other bits of information being part of your main text. So if they want to find out more about that, they can just click on the link and go from there. Then, of course, part of your methodology needs to include how you evaluated your studies. So, of course, you're going to get the full text of your studies. You're going to see, is it a high quality paper? Is it a low quality paper? What stood out from that paper? For this study in particular, we then went on to perform a critical appraisal. So there are specific guidelines regarding how to perform a critical appraisal, and that's done using what's called the Critical Appraisal Skills Program tools. So you can find that if you Google online, but it will help find the key points for each paper, and it helps you more analyze the paper and see which ones are better quality and which ones are therefore better conclusions for you to draw based on your study. Once you've got your methodology, you then go into the body of your paper where you're talking about the different training strategies. So the body of the paper is where you're addressing your question. So the question for this study is, what are the training strategies for cleft lip and palate in low-income countries? So once we've identified the studies that we're including, we go into these training strategies in a bit more detail. So you talk about all the studies that you've included. For the sake of this paper, the studies were then summarized in table format as separate supplementary files. The last thing is then talking about how to optimize training. So based on the conclusions from the included studies, you can find out ways to improve your target, and then, of course, your conclusion. So that's everything with regards to your literature reviews, a very brief overview of literature reviews. So what are the key points? You're not going to do a description of each and every paper. You need to find the key points from each study and bring them together to find an overall conclusion and an overall idea of what information exists and what needs to be done in the future to optimize, be it your training or your clinical management of a condition, whatever your answer, whatever your question is from the beginning of your study. Thank you very much for listening. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me on my direct email account or through the UK PRC. Thank you very much. Have a good day.